yeah, I'm Merope. I'm a partner and editor. Welcome to Tortoise. Welcome to our Festival of ThinkIns, which my colleague Matthew described as this morning as the Glastonbury of the mind. So I'm stealing that. As James said, this isn't a panel event. It's a forum for organised listening. It's a way of hearing your ideas and your thoughts on the subject. And like any sort of news conference, it works best when we hear from as many people in the room as possible, which means we definitely do want to hear your point of view. Do stick your hand up throughout. But we do have one rule, which is no questions. But again, that doesn't mean we don't want you to talk. We do want you to talk. We just don't want you to hide behind a question. We want to hear what you think about on this topic. I'm just going to start with a little bit of housekeeping. Please turn off your phones if you haven't already. I do need to tell you that you're being filmed. These are little cameras and these hanging down are mics. And this little tortoise going across the screen here is a timer. That shows how long we've got to talk about the subject. It'll give us a little note when it's 5 minutes to the end, and at the end a flag goes up. So please keep an eye on Agatha, as she's named, the tortoise timer, if you have something to say. We're very fortunate to have some invited guests with us here to start the conversation. I'm just going to introduce them. We have Tallulah Lewes here, who is the chair of Women in Racing. We've got Ed Ramsden, who's the director at Lewes Football Club, and Ian Ridley, who's a sports journalist, and his wife Vicky, who is also a sports journalist, died earlier this year. She was the first female football writer on a tabloid paper, that's right. Tallulah, I'm going to start with you. Would you just sort of talk us through the situation of women in racing? Because you would think that that would be a sort of parallel kind of pay structure. It's not, you know, jockeys are about the same height and weight, etc. But
yeah, we're in quite a unique position in the horse racing industry in that men and women compete on the same playing field. So they're open to ride in the same races against each other. So we have equality in that sense, and we also have a fee structure that riding fees are the same for men and women. So it's an interesting concept because they're on equal pay in terms of their riding fee. But where the kind of disparity comes through for us is the fact that the kind of number of female jockeys compared to men, there's quite a few less, and we don't have that kind of dominance from female jockeys. But they then don't get as much of the kind of the commercial and sponsorship deals that are out there. So we're kind of in a bit of a warped world in that if you looked at us on the surface, it was like, oh yeah, equal on the playing field, equal pay, this is great. But then as soon as you kind of delve straight into that, you kind of get the situations where there's not enough female jockeys getting ride, and then they don't get noticed, they don't get sponsorships to kind of bulk up their earnings.
And because, you know, the earnings alone are not enough to live off.
No.
Like 21,000.
Yeah, so an average kind of, depending on how many rides they take within the year, they're probably on a kind of mid-20s pay, which is not a huge amount for the kind of level of the sport. It's the second most attended sport in the country after football. So where they're trying, you know, they kind of bulk up those earnings through sponsorship deals and through their kind of commercial angles, which they're not exposed to as often because they're receiving less rides.
Okay, thank you. And Ian, you are married to a female sports journalist who is very sort of well known and respected in her field and herself experienced level of prejudice, but you think the question we're asking is too simplistic.
Well, I do, in the sense that it's a perfectly valid question, should women earn the same as men? And the obvious answer is yes. I mean, and there is legislation in pretty much every area of work these days, as there should be. I think with sport, it's a bit more nuanced in that, for example, you know, I know we'll talk about Lewes and they pay men and women the same at that football club. But if you take Manchester City, for example, should the women at Manchester City get the same as men? Well, there are several questions, several elements to that. Do women want to be subsidised by men's football for a start, or do they want to stand on their own 2 feet? Do you want football clubs to be sustainable or just have cash injections? So I think, you know, those questions are the important ones, and it's a little more nuanced. As a journalist myself, I always feel, you know, I come to everywhere I go now these days, I've sort of got what would Vicky think in my mind and what would she say. But I've spoken to other people, and I'm sure it'll come up later, but I spoke to Jane Purden, who's the Chief Executive of Women in Football. Vicky was a board member there, and I've done a lot of work with them. And I asked her, give me some points, and her first one was equal prize money. You've got to look at this sport by sport. In some sports, the time is right for this, in others, not so. In football, the question is not should prize money be equal, pending growth of the game commercially, but is it equitable, e.g. for the Women's FA Cup? It's not. And that is an exceptionally good point, because the FA can do whatever it wants with the pot of money it gets. It can redistribute. 2 years ago, for example, and Eddie will know this, it doubled the prize money for the FA Cup. Now, it wasn't that it suddenly got twice as much money in, but it decided to redistribute in a different way. And it could decide to do that with the Women's FA Cup. I've got the figures later, and they'll probably come up. But it is very inequitable what happens in the Men's and Women's FA Cup. Same with the World Cup at the moment with women. FIFA are rolling in money. They could absolutely treble 10 times the prize money for women's football and develop it so that we don't see inequitable things like Thailand being beaten 13-0 and what have you. That happened in the men's game as well years and years ago. They can accelerate the process by throwing money at the women's game quite quickly here. Those are my initial thoughts. Anyway, there's so much bubbling here. I'll leave it at that.
We'll come back to some of those points, but I'll come to you now, Ed. So tell us a bit about what you do at Lewes.
Okay, well, I'm one of the directors of Lewes Football Club. We're the only football club, I think, in the world that pays women and men the same, allocates resources equally between women and men, which was something that we only figured out was the right thing to do 2 years ago. So we started doing that 2 years ago, which is slightly embarrassingly late, even though nobody else has joined us.
What? Can I just ask what started that thought?
Well, and I should say you're going to have to cut me off because I could talk this whole hour. But, and there are some points that I really definitely want to make. But we became a community-owned football club in 2010. And so any of you can buy a share in Lewes Football Club. It'll cost you £40 a year, lewesfc.com/owners. Recommend it. And then you'll have the same ownership interest in the club that I do or that anybody else does. You can only own one share. And our basic idea was, when we took over the club, was that we wanted to try and set a good example in football because football has such a great deal of meaning. Like, it's got such a lot of meaning in the culture beyond any kind of financial scale. You know, even the big football clubs in the world, think about Manchester United. Market value of Manchester United is like £3 billion, something like that. That's tiny. Like, most investment managers couldn't invest in it because it's too small. But the amount of meaning that it carries is enormous. And so what we wanted to do was, in a world where it felt to us that these were like sacred community assets, these football clubs, and they weren't being treated like that by their owners, we wanted to show, look, you can actually do stuff in this really important arena that resonates and sets a good example in the culture. And there's lots of things that we've done, and we haven't got time to get into them. But it took us a long time to figure out that actually the real glaring, huge disparity in football, in this thing that means so much to everybody in this country and the world, was around gender. And it was so big that you almost couldn't see it. You know, the disparities are, it's not like gender pay gap normally. You know, these disparities are ridiculous. So, to Ian's point about the FA Cup, so the FA 2 years ago had a situation where the total prize money paid to men in the FA Cup was £15 million, and the total prize money paid to women was £250,000, right? And the FA decided we want to allocate another £15 million to the FA Cup prize money, and they gave it all to the men. So they doubled the 15 to 30 and kept the women on £250,000. Now, I don't think that anyone at the FA is thinking, let's aggravate this already ridiculous disparity. I think it's a succession of people taking these poor decisions because they're not thinking about the whole system. And what we're trying to do is think about the whole system. And really, the reason this matters is, there's a great quote from an American academic called Jane English that says something like, if women and men don't get roughly equal fame and fortune from sports, then it encourages everybody, women and men, to think of women as inferior, right? So it really matters. It's really centrally important to the culture. And to this, the question of this thinking, should men and women be paid the same in sport? Well, of course they should, right? Of course women and men should be paid the same in sport. The only argument against women and men being paid the same in sport would be if there was... The argument that people always come up with is demand, right? Okay, so, you know, fewer people watch women's sport than men's sport, fewer people want to attend women's matches than men's matches. But the only argument that could sustain women and men being paid differently in sport would be if there was some, like, inherent human characteristic that meant that people preferred to watch men playing sport than women playing sport. So people, if presented equally, didn't want to watch women, they wanted to watch men. Or, you know, if you saw an advert for a Honda car beside a women's football match, you were less likely to buy it than if you saw it before a men's football match. But there is enormous, overwhelming evidence that that is not the case. And actually, the differences arise from huge disparities in media coverage and huge disparities in the development of the cultures in these games. So if you think about women's football and men's football in this country, right? We had a situation in 1920 where women's football was more popular than men's football, and then the all-male FA banned women's football for 50 years, right? So at the moment, when all of these like really important central bits of cultural iconography were being like seared into all of our brains, you know, Jeff Hurst scoring a hat-trick in the FA Cup final in 1966, everything, women's football was banned, right? So at the moment Jeff Hurst scored, no woman could play football. And that de facto ban continued till about like the early 1990s. And now we're in a situation where the world says to us, okay, women and men shouldn't be paid the same because demand is lower for women's football. And I think where we're at is like, well, no shit, right? Of course it's lower, right? You've been in a situation where this one product has been like completely banned from any dispersion into the culture for 70 years and then given no resources. And you've got another one that's had all of this cultural input. So I don't think should women and men be paid the same in sport is even an interesting question, right? I mean, right, no knock on Tortoise, but
well,
I think you guys do great stuff. But of course they should be paid the same in sport, right? There's no inherent characteristic that means that people want to watch women doing sport less than they want to watch men doing sport. All of the situation we find ourselves in is a result of really low media coverage driving really low interest and attendance, driving really low commercial outcomes. And so actually the interesting question to ask is, how do we get to a point where women and men are paid the same in sport as quickly as we can, right? That is the end game. Remember, you're not allowed to ask questions. That is the end game.
You're allowed
right?
to ask questions.
But how quickly can we get there? And what we're trying to do at Lewes Football Club, in our tiny little way, right? You know, we're a little town and people can't even pronounce us. Everyone pronounces us as Lewes, and that's bad for a football club. You know, what we're trying to do is be a catalyst to get to this state that we know the world is going to get to, but we're trying to get to it quicker, right? And one of the important aspects of all of this discussion is so much of this is just down to choices, right? Individual choices. So if you look at any media organisation, you look at Tortoise, you look at The Guardian, you look at the BBC, a set of human beings is making a choice not to cover women and men's sport 50-50, right? And in my view, every media organisation with immediate effect should commit to 50-50. They should say, okay, we're going to cover women and men's sport equally from now on, right? It's a no-brainer. And also, it's like there's a free opportunity for people to look really good because this is going to happen, right? 20, 30 years from now, we will look back now at, oh my God, I'm opening The Guardian, right? Which is, you know, bastion of equal rights and everything else, right? I'm opening The Guardian, it's like 90% of its coverage, maybe not during the Women's World Cup, although even then there's more about men's sport, 90% of the coverage is about men's sport, and that's the best of them, right? We'll look back on that, and we'll look back on that like we look back at all these cultural anachronisms in the 1970s now, right? And we'll say, whoa, that was super weird. We lived in a world where women's sport was just invisible, and now it's not. So there's an opportunity for people to actually step up now. So you know, what we're trying to do in our tiny little way is be the catalyst in all of these reactions. So because we pay women and men the same and we allocate resources equally to women and men, which incidentally has been fantastic, and our women's attendances have doubled each of the last 2 years. They're now the same as our men's attendances.
Even though you put up the price of the ticket for the women's events.
Yeah, so, you know, we have put up the price of the women's tickets because we're trying to bring it into line with the men's tickets, and we will be in line next season. So, for example, last season, we increased price by 60% for the women's home matches, and attendances went up 140%. Because there, you know, we haven't got time.
There's an argument with price. People look at a price as something low and then value it as low.
Exactly.
Whereas if you increase the price on a commodity and then people look at it, then they're thinking, oh, that's actually got some value to it.
Totally right. Every other football club...
When you say we pay them the same, do you mean that you give the manager of the men's and the women's team the same budget?
Yeah,
within that they allocate
that's
however
right.
they...
Yeah, we don't like pay every player the same, right?
Exactly.
You know, we allocate our resources, commercial, financial, attention, everything.
Because one thing we have to remember, that even in men's football, players in the same team are not paid the same.
Of course they're not, right? And we wouldn't expect that.
And a better woman player is going to be paid more than a worse woman player.
Look, whisper it, but, you know, there's all kinds of stuff I'm probably not allowed to say, but like, our highest paid player across the whole club last season was female, right? So, you know...
Let's hear from...
So I want to... There's a couple of hands up already. I'm going to... Who shall I go to first? I think that there was a... I'll go to you first, and then I think there was a little hand there.
My name's Chris. I am thinking aloud here, because you've raised a question that I haven't really thought about two things, really. You talked about, first of all, the sort of meaning of football clubs.
Yeah.
And the second thing about, is there anything kind of inherently or innate about whether we'd want to watch men or women play football? Now, I'm for my sins, a Spurs fan, right? Watching Tottenham, for me, has kind of meaning beyond just watching two, you know, guys on a pitch. It's like, it's all to do with my family. My grandfather's a season ticket holder.
Weird thing, right? Almost religious.
Yeah, there's a kind of whole lot, and I actually don't really want to watch any other team other than Tottenham. So,
do you watch the Spurs women's team?
No, I don't. I have no interest in really. I don't want to watch football at any other level. It's just Tottenham because it has a kind of meaning to me and my family that sort of transcends everything. So, just in pure commercial terms, my money is going to that, and I'm just kind of can't quite square that with them.
Well, let me help you square that, right? So, what we assign meaning to, right, in our lives, what we like to spend money on and spend our attention on, which is kind of the same thing, is what our society has told us has meaning, right? So, yeah, you feel that way about Tottenham Hotspur because that's how you grew up, that's how you came up. But you think about other cultures, you think about people who are like really into kabaddi or curling or darts or, you know, all of these sports that don't have a lot of meaning, apologies to darts fans, don't have a lot of meaning really in our culture, but to some people and to some like big geographical areas, they're absolutely freighted with meaning, right? And people draw meaning from other things too, right? I mean, good Lord, like when one's talking about is there a demand for women's sport, I mean, there's a demand for like deal or no deal, right? people assign meaning all over the place. So, it's exactly the point that what we as a collective, not just the people in this room, but we as a collective, as a society need to do is help meaning be assigned to women's sport. And the way that one does that is by giving attention to it, right? Think about snooker, right? You know, you look like you're almost as old as me. So you will remember that when we were, you know, 10 or something, there's only like 3 TV channels, and somebody took the decision that snooker was going to be televised, right? There's no inherent appeal to snooker, right? It's like two chain-smoking men knocking a bunch of little balls around a green table. Like, there's nothing inherently appealing about that, and yet it carried tons of meaning because it was available, right? And so all of these people, like, you know, we all cared about Steve Davis or Hurricane Hibbins or Cliff Thorburn. It's nuts, right? It's a game in a pub.
But Eddie, that meaning was assigned to us. That was to do with colour television.
For sure.
But
my only point is that's not because of any innate characteristic of Tottenham Hotspur or it being men, right? It's because it was very available and culturally central. And that's what we need to do as a collective with women's sport.
I'm going to come to you first and then you in the stripes.
I just wanted to pick up on the meaning point. I'm also Chris, I'm also a Spurs fan. We didn't plan this. And I think the meaning point's an interesting one, you know, as a fellow Spurs fan, because I think, you know, what is it that gives football meaning for us, right? It's not the players change, the managers change, the grounds change, you know, everything changes, but there's something about what that is. You know, some clubs leave their communities. So there's something about the badge, which is why it's interesting that this isn't a dig at you, by the way, but it is interesting that you don't want to watch the women's team, because it's still the badge, and it's under the same umbrella, and we're one community, and actually there's something about the fact that you know, it's become, you know, we're adding a bit more, as a football club, we're adding more meaning to it by bringing the women's team under the same umbrella. I mean, for the first time now, the Tottenham are in the WSL, and actually the Tottenham Hotspur board have taken on the running of the women's team, as opposed to sort of outsourcing it to some other people. So there's something interesting there. But I just want to come back to the pay point. What we're talking about here isn't necessarily actually about equal pay. I hate to drop the word so early. We're talking about patriarchy. We're talking about what women's value is in society, right? And actually, we have a different value in the sense of, you know, whether it's interesting to watch women play sport. I mean, the US women's national team is a brilliant example for this, right? They launched a gender discrimination suit against the US Soccer Federation on International Women's Day this year. For equal pay. They have consistently been more successful than the US men's national soccer team. They've won more tournaments, they have better attendances, you know, yet they scored more goals, for example, against Thailand than the men's team scored in 2 World Cups, right? In one game. Yet they're not paid the same. The US Soccer Federation's got £150 million sitting in its coffers, right? The Fox News deal that they do for the US women's national for the US teams is not because of the men's team. The Nike sponsorship that the US Soccer Federation get is for the women's team, and it's a choice. They're making an active choice not to pay the women the same, and that's why this is a good example, because, you know, you have all of these arguments about the commercial reality of football. We haven't got the bums on seats, we can't pay the women as much, etc. But the commercial reality for the US women's national team is there, but they're still not being paid the same. So I agree with what Ed's saying, but I also think there's another element to it. It's not just about the media equals the commercial, whatever. Because here we've seen the media equals the commercial, and then we're still not being paid the same. So there's another element there, which is something around what we do about how women are valued in society.
I've got some points to make about that later. Your name's Chris, yes?
Yes.
Some of my colleagues are laughing, they're not surprised by that. The gentleman in the stripes.
Just picking up on a point that Ed talked about, people want to go and see men's football rather than women's football. I'm a Reading supporter, and I've seen many appalling Reading matches at various levels and whatever. And what my thought coming back on that point was last night in the pub in North London watching the women's England team, when Lucy Bronze scored the 3rd goal.
Crazy goal.
The whole pub went mad.
Yeah.
That was fantastic. It doesn't matter whether it's a woman or a man scoring that goal. They're cheering the skill that comes into that. 8 years ago at the Women's World Cup, my other son and I were talking about this the other day. The standard was terrible. In 2 successive World Cups, that standard has gone up enormously. And what people are really wanting is to watch the skill. And the investment that's been put into women's football in then, although it's probably not enough, has obviously paid dividends, because a whole pub just roared because of that amazing thing that happened.
What's your name, sorry? Joel.
Joel, yeah.
Joel. Actually, so I'm just going to quickly flick through some slides, and then I have that goal on hand for anyone who... So, oh wait, we're going to go straight to it. Nicely done, team. So this is the goal that you're talking about, right? So if you haven't seen it, take a look.
She was the one that was fouled as well, so she picked herself up quite nicely.
Can you play it? Can you play it?
Lucy Bronze has gone up to the edge of the penalty area again. He's looming up dangerously. They've had their warning. They've had their warning. Here's Lucy.
I mean, that is an incredible goal. And just to throw in some stats here, I was trying to look for the overnights for this. We have it. Kerry's got them. Kerry's coming in on the wire. Kerry's got the few figures from last night.
The media reporter has 7.5 million people watched that game. I think it's 7.5 million.
So 7.5 million last night. In France, the opening game got 10.6 million. Just to give an indication of that, the average across the group stages of the Men's World Cup in France was 10.2 million. In Brazil, 19.7 million saw the women's team victory against Jamaica. And in this country, the BBC, 3 of the women's matches are among the top 10 of the most watched football games of this year so far. So, you know, it's hard to say that the demand isn't there.
But the demand is there because it's such good football.
Yeah, because
that's the reason.
Can I be churlish? Can I just lob something in to be churlish? One, I think the goalkeeper should have done better. Two, these figures are great, and they're on BBC One, and that's what is needed, so that young people can see this. But they're still only a third of the England men's last year in the World Cup for an equivalent World Cup quarter-final. So there's no point getting complacent about this as long. It's a long way to go.
It's a long game.
Yeah.
I'm going to come to you next, and then I'd really love it if some of the younger people who I'm seeing, and this is me giving you some warning. I know you're watching the World Cup, or the boys maybe you're not, but I'd love to hear your points of view. But can I go to the gentleman in the checks? What's your name?
Martin. So I'm just going to quickly challenge the quality point, and Ian will sympathise with me here as a St Albans City supporter. I've watched possibly some of the worst football you've never watched, but I still went back. And that's, I don't think it actually comes down necessarily to quality. For some people it will, for the armchair fan, yes, but for a lot of people that's not the case. It's following the team. Now, I've watched a lot of the World Cup. I have to say the BBC have done okay, but still a lot of them red button, and that's a difference, isn't it? That's an extra barrier between people watching it and not. And articles, listening to podcasts and so on. And actually what I've found listening to ex-pros, women pros speaking about this, I've heard less about the pay and more about training and the opportunity. For example, a lot of people, I've fed up having conversations with friends of mine about the size of goals in women's football. They should be smaller. And I fundamentally disagree. The problem is that women's goalkeepers, for example, don't have the same level of training. They've not had the time, or say the early 90s was when women's football was allowed to start being played again. Women's goalkeepers don't get the full-time training that the men's do. And actually there's an argument that why can't boys and girls train together at a youth age? And really that for me, and from what I've heard from those pundits, is that's where the money needs to go. I don't hear them talking about pay. I hear them talking about the training, the facilities, those opportunities. And I also think we need, just one last thing, is actually separate the pay between the club and the country. There's no argument country should be paid the same. I think, as has already been alluded to, it's a bit tougher for the clubs because of the level you're playing at. For example, Lewes, it's an honourable thing you've done, but the women are playing at a much higher standard than the men are.
Well, that's because we pay them the same, but the market's massively distorted, right?
That's, and hopefully,
we've got women,
one day
with the same money, we've got a women's team that's full of internationals and a men's team that's playing at level 7, right? Yeah. That's...
And so what I'm saying is it's difficult to balance that at the moment. You could change the international football like that tomorrow.
Yeah, I think the thing is, and this comes back to Chris's point about patriarchy, it's like, people say that racism isn't an event, it's a structure, right? And gender difference in sport, they're not like little episodes, it's an overarching structure, and it's all interrelated. So my view is to say, well, it's not about pay, it's about training, or it's not about England, it's about clubs. It's all all encompassing, and we need to try and figure out.
There's incremental steps, and what is the one thing that will lead to that higher standard you talk of? Is making sure that women from a young age all the way through to professionals have the highest level of facilities and so on that the men have. There's no argument that they can't have that, but all those things are incremental steps.
Even at the high school.
Right. I've seen these guys comparing notes about what they're going to say. No, so tell us what you think. What do you think? Are you watching the World Cup?
Yeah.
And what do you think?
I think it's just as good. It's just like people's mentality. They don't think women are as like the endorsement. People don't think that they're the same just because they're women, or that they even when you're little, football is a boys' sport. People don't expect you to. When I was younger, I was told to do things like swimming or things that are more female orientated, but that doesn't mean that you should be discouraged to do something, or it should get less coverage or less pay just because of your gender.
What's your name?
Jasmine.
Jasmine, is there football at your school? Is there girls' football?
Yeah.
There is. And do you feel it gets the same attention, investment?
No, even the girls' team has one team over the whole school, and the boys have three. They get different tournaments, different. Even in the corridors, there's more pictures of the boys. Sports seem to be more a male orientated sport, when it's just the same. It just doesn't get enough recognition.
And I'm going to go to some of the boys from your school. Do you think that's a fair point? What's your name there?
My name is Eunice.
Hi, Eunice.
My point is quite fair. I've seen the girls only have one team across the whole school, and the boys have multiple teams per year, and there are around 4 years in our school. So I remember in year 7, my year had 3 football teams, whereas the girls had to share with the other years. And the boys football teams had many more competitions, and I don't think that was fair, because when I was in primary school, there was a girl that I used to play with, and she was much better than most of the boys. She was probably top 3 in the whole school. And then we come to secondary school, and all of a sudden we're not allowed to play with her anymore.
Yeah.
And I think toxic masculinity has something to do with that, because from a young age, boys are told to avoid women. You shouldn't have fun with them, and they're made to just exist and be toys of the boys when they're older.
Thank you, Eunice. I think that is an extremely wise contribution.
There's an interesting comparison with horse racing and women coming into the sport. So our entry level is 50-50 of male and females entering the sport who want to then go on to become performers in the sports and jockeys. But coming back to your point within resources and what's there, and then also to the kind of role model and seeing people out there, if you're not seeing someone who can do that job, we all know that, doesn't matter if you're in sport or through the corporate landscape, if you don't see someone in a job at that height, you're not going to strive for it because you don't have the role model. But then bringing the resources into that on top of it, across race courses we have a real issue with women having changing rooms. There's one changing room, that's where all the jockeys are meant to change. Well, that doesn't work when you want, to add female jockeys into the equation. So adding in this kind of resource point onto that is quite a strong progressive for women achieving where they need to get to in sport. You've got to have that, drive to get them. We have such a, we're 50-50 when we come in, and then the drop-off is huge.
Yeah.
It's absolutely huge, and something that we're looking at in the sport is at what level, right down to that bottom level of people coming in, what can we do? Because I think you touched on it before, Ed, the solution. Let's not just talk about the question, what is the solution? What are the actual kind of things that we can start doing? So something that the sport is looking at is putting in female changing rooms across every single race course, even if they've never had a female jockey ride there. Putting in, making sure there's a physio room that's not in the male changing rooms. It's in a neutral room where either sex can go and use the physio, and then bringing in and really just highlighting the small things. I think you guys are doing a great thing. You found a thing, you've picked it, and you're going for it. I think often we get caught up in actually just talking about it. Let's start doing something, pick something, see if it works. If it doesn't, throw your hands up, say that hasn't worked, try the next one. We've got to start actually actioning these thoughts and really doing something to make those changes.
That's our thing, deeds not words, like the suffragettes, right? I mean, to your point, Jasmine, it's when you walk down the corridors in your school and you see all of these representations of male sporting excellence and very few of female sporting excellence, every day that just bangs into your head a message, right? And it's, to Eunice's point, it's it reinforces this message that females are decorative, not active. right? And that males are active, not decorative, and that women have to be perfect, and men are allowed not to be perfect. And all this stuff, like, it's all so baked into everything that you just can't see it. And one of the things that we're trying to do is, exactly like you talk about in racing, is try to recognize all of these barriers that are kind of invisible because you're so used to them, and change them, right? And yeah, it's difficult, but like, what better thing is there to do?
Ian has got some words from Paula Radcliffe, is that right? And then I'd love to see a show of hands. So
I mean, I think it's interesting that the conversation has gravitated towards football all the time, because obviously it's our national sport. But Vicky was the athletics correspondent of the Sun, and that was her love. She started as a football writer and went to football when she was young with her father at Sheffield United, but she developed into an athletics writer. And while I'm on the subject of Vicky, I owe her a great debt for reconstructing me in many ways, because although I was on The Guardian for 10 years, I kind of didn't think about these things the way that a woman thought about these things, and she had to go through a lot in her career through inequality and pay and all those things. But I emailed Paula Radcliffe, who was a friend of Vicky's and came to her funeral, and I said, what's your take on this equal pay for men and women? And she emailed me back, I can't really think of too many occasions where I lost out as a woman. Prize money in athletics and road races is equal, which is very interesting. And road appearance and contracts are according to perceived athlete value to event brand rather than on male to female. In fact, she was paid a lot more because she was world marathon champion than a lot of men, and quite rightly. All money to Olympians is the same, men and women. So, all lottery funding is equal, which is a huge advance. She went on, I think some sports, football, tennis, have a big issue in this area, but athletics is a lot more equal and balanced. And this is an interesting point, I do feel that something can be done to protect around pregnancy, but also see the performance industry side of it that needs some kind of guarantee that women will even try to come back and not see it as 2 years pay for nothing. I also feel a better way to go is some kind of union insurance for all athletes to cover against any extended period unable to compete. This is fairer to both sides.
Thank you for that. I'll come to you. Hello, what's your name?
My name's Laura.
Hi, Laura.
Right. I just wanted to make some parallels with cycling. I think cycling as a sport has a really long way to go. And I think the sport has gone around in circles a little bit with the chicken and egg situation of needing media exposure, media coverage, sponsorship to drive the demand, to get more women cycling, and round and round and round we go. And actually I think what I've seen recently is social media being a really interesting driving force in getting better exposure for women's cycling. And actually to Jasmine's point about the visibility point, I think social media has shown a lot more of the younger generation about that there are female cyclists out there, and they're doing really well, and actually their individual social media profiles are garnering more media support and sponsorship. So although there isn't equal broadcast rights across male and female cycling, I think social is doing a lot to improve it. And the second point is about triathlon. So triathlon is a much newer sport, and that's coming through much more equally than it's not inherited the years and years of cycling patriarchy that sport's seen.
Thank you, thanks Laura. And I'm just going to go to our members at the back who's representing one of our members who can stay, and then I'd like to come to this gentleman in the glasses. Right.
So I was talking to a Tortoise member, Lisa Gershon, who wasn't able to stay. She was here this morning. But she's a senior coach at one of the big London tennis clubs, and she wanted me to sort of lay some points on her behalf. And I think they talked to some of the structural barriers to equality that we've touched on in a slightly different way. Firstly, she wanted to say that there seems to be a default in the flavour of these types of conversations that she has, that the way that the boys play sport, the sort of masculine standard would be the normal thing. And if the girls could just be a bit more like the men, then everything would be better in her sport, which is tennis. She sort of held a very strong view that, you know, the discussion about pay equality in tennis is to do with, well, men play 5 sets and the girls play 3, so obviously they play for longer, so da-da-da-da. And her argument very strongly was if everybody played 3-set tennis with no tiebreak in the third set, you just kept on playing and playing, you'd still get the big matches, you still get the grandstand feeling, it was desperately exciting, and wouldn't that be better? But isn't it interesting that the masculine default isn't necessarily the right one? And then her other sort of side point was, she said, it took me 25 years to get to the level that I am as a sort of the first senior female coach in a big club in the UK, and she did that some years ago, and I think 8 years later she said there are now 2 others, and it just feels like it's an incredibly long time to get to that kind of parity in coaching, and went on to talk about how the way that she coaches her female proteges, I don't know what you would say, is a different way. Her approach to coaching is very different. But it's hard for women to land the big coaching jobs in tennis because the job description involves being away for a lot of the year, and that generally is more difficult for women if they want to be running a family and so on and so forth. So that whole structural piece, on the one hand it's, you know, single sex changing rooms, and on the other hand is, can you physically be able to organise your life to do the job, is really challenging things.
Thank you. Thank you. What's your name?
Dakari.
Sorry?
Dakari.
Dakari.
But when I first came here, I was actually for, but now I'm slightly against. And the reason I say that is because...
so just clarify what you mean by that.
So I was with the fact that men and women should be paid the same in sports.
You felt you should. Now we've changed your mind.
Yeah, because...
Worry.
I knew you were going to say that as well. This is partially because, obviously as a young teenager, I'm always on my phone. And as one of the main causes why men and women, in my opinion, shouldn't be paid the same is because of social media as a propaganda. On my phone, I'm always seeing men on athletics, motorcycling, motorcycling, all the different sports around me are always shown as men because they have been dominant figures since day one, as I would say. So that's one of the reasons why I would say men and women should be paid the same.
Because you see them more.
Yeah, I see.
Because they're visible to you.
Yeah, they're more visible in society. Like especially night time around the corner.
I'm gonna come to that. Well, actually, I'll go to your classmate first. And then.
But I feel like, I don't know if it's a subconscious or a conscious decision, but it's not even thought of for girls. Like even in school, like the girls' teams, they might even succeed more than the boys' teams, but it's not even thought to even take a picture or to like express or expose them so everyone can see that they're doing well. It's not even thought of. Like, and in your mind, whether like you're aware of it or not, you're thinking that even as a girl, I have to strive so much more just to show that I'm here playing the sport or doing what I'm doing. The girls' team in football are in the semi-finals, and they haven't even thought of taking a picture of them. But the boys are out of the competition and they're pictured up. It's like whether you can. It's like a decision. Whether they do it on purpose or not, it's a decision to make them to show us, and we're not showing, so we don't really have anything to like aim for.
Do you see what Dakari? Do you see what she's saying, that you know they're not even given the opportunity to present themselves?
Yeah, I do understand what she means, but yeah, for me, because okay, so I do athletics, and because as boys we were so physically talented, is one of the reasons why I believe that everybody in our school would actually kind of float towards our side, in a sense. I'm not saying women aren't physically talented, technically, like, or 50% within the sport, but I feel like because they didn't carry out more skills which are more like exciting and more mostly seen by people around our school, that's one of the reasons why they don't necessarily float to women's.
I'm going to go to these I just want to go to these 2 women here and then over here. So what's your name? Jessica. You go first, the lady with the hairband.
I'm Jessica, and
what's your name?
Jessica.
Jessica.
And I agree with Desmond in terms of like there's no like effort put into like being put into girls sport. For example, I'm a basketball player.
Would you just talk up a little bit? Sorry.
I'm a basketball player, and in our school it was like the boys were getting more like training and more, you know, there was more effort into them. There was no effort into because therefore like that's the reason why there's no like recognition, and that's why like the current wouldn't see girls sport on their phone as much, because there's no effort being put into like recognising girls sport and the talent they have. And if there was, there'd be a huge difference in how like, you know, sport is seen for like both girls and
boys. It's the grassroots point again. And
I'm Maisha. Just to add to what Jessica and Jasmine were saying, how I think in our school especially, I'm a netballer, so I've been playing since year 7, and up until year 11, I've won every single league. However, we were not once like awarded, and like when it came to like we have an award ceremony every year, like every other year. Not once did we get like, oh, netball team won the year team of the year or anything like that. And I think ever since then, it's like netball hasn't been played by the younger years as much as like when I was younger. And it's just like I understand why like there's no effort being put into like given the opportunity and like the recognition that the females of our school should get, and especially at a younger age. I think like it needs to be like embedded into them, like, oh, you guys are so well and stuff like that. That's just my opinion.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm gonna go to you next for a class, and then over there, and then. Sorry.
I agree with what Jasmine just said, because in my school I play football, and our girls football team have had to play with either the younger people or the older people just for us to create a full team. And most of the time we've made it to like stages around semi-finals and quarter-finals, and haven't even got to take a picture or even nominated for an award. However, the boys who got kicked out in the early stage got to have a picture up, and they still go to more tournaments than us and get more training sessions, which I feel like is unfair, because it's really caused like a lot of people to drop out of football because they feel like what's the point of us doing anymore.
Have you raised that at the school? Have you said to them?
Yeah.
I'm just going to interrupt to go to your teacher. I'm really sorry, but you're here, and this is obviously a really big issue in your school. Is it talked about at sort of staff level?
It will be now.
I hope so.
As a point of order, we have produced one Olympian and one sports person who contributed at the European Championships, both of which were female.
Good point. I'm gonna. So there's the lady in white, and then you, and then I'll come to James.
I think it's. I'm Hannah.
Hannah, hi.
I think it's clear from what everyone's saying is it's to do with the people in charge. So I'm in athletics, and I run for a club where it's quite a historic club. So it's been around since the 19th century, and it's historically been all about the men. And currently the women are more successful than the men, but again, it's about coverage. So on our website, when we have news stories, it's the men may have come 25th out of however many, and we've come 3rd, and yet the men lead every time in the news articles. All the headlines are men, and then the women have the sort of token, oh yes, and the women also won the national championships at the end of that. And it's to do with the people who run these clubs. They all generally are older men, and it's not that they think, oh, the women are really rubbish, it just doesn't cross their minds. They don't think about reporting about women.
What's your name again?
Hannah.
Hannah, okay, I'm just going to let you, oh God, there's so many
I just want to say, can I just say very briefly on that? I was chairman of a non-league football club, and everybody's got an idea of how the club should be changed. And my response was, do it, change it. Make sure you get involved on the website. Right, do it.
There was a hand here, and then I'm coming to you, and then you and Green, right? And then you go first.
I'm Luke. I thought the conversation kind of quite rightly climbed down from the initial premise, which was about some sort of enforcement of salary outcome. Because I think you mentioned at the beginning that there's a lot of complexity to carving that up. It's like, is it for the athletes? Is it for the supporting staff? Is it for the physios? Is it for the people who are involved, not just in salary, but like compensation for injury or career-ending injury? And it's quite obvious that this reverts back, I think, to what do you do initially to encourage people to be involved in sport. And I think that's because something you were saying about meaning. It's not just that sport has meaning in a cultural sense, but it's also like it can give you this amazing revelation about what humans can do. And it's not what men can do, what women can do, but what humans can do. And I think that's why we orientate to it so strongly. But that has to be, I think, not about how we build a state that can guarantee people get paid certain amounts or franchises that can guarantee it, but just how young people and old people or whatever get invested and can speak that meaning to other people. And that's what you see when the Women's World Cup happens. But I'd be scared of a state that could enforce salary outcomes for for athletes of all kinds today or next year. I think that's a mistake. But.
Okay. Thank you. I'm gonna. You've had your hand up for ages.
No worries. It's I'm Tom. I'm from Tortoise. I just wanted to take it in a little bit of a different direction, in something that's a little bit different. I teach martial arts to a local community, and I teach girls and guys in the same room. And I think that the gentleman's point about talent is entirely wrong. Talent is not natural. There is a natural ability, but talent is only time in practice, and that's the only difference between an expert and a novice. And I think that to drive this forward and to make it more positive, what we do need is more positive role models with more exposure. A good example of this was the UFC mixed martial arts fight. And in 2011, Dana White, the president of the UFC, said that he would never have a woman headlining one of his cards. That was until Ronda Rousey came along and changed the game entirely. Now we're seeing women that are matching men's salaries. In 2018, Chris Cyborg managed to pull in near on the same as most of the top 10 men in the categories. And arguably some of the weight categories and the fights that are happening now are of a better standard than some of the men's fights. So I think what drives this up is the exposure, and also the time and investment into that practice to be able to raise the bar.
Thank you. Thanks. The leading reader then, James.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to return to the comment that was made earlier that men's sport is exciting. And we've seen this, I grew up with this, that, you know, men's management style in work, that's the way forward. And the styles that we grew up to say, these are the successful things, are often white, older and male. And we've seen actually there's so much research from all sectors saying this doesn't work. When you have equality in the boardroom, for example, you have better, more successful companies. We see this, you know, in government, you have better, more successful governments and countries, and the sport needs to be the same. Just because there's differences does not mean we shouldn't default to the male always being the more exciting and the default. There can be differences, and also that's really toxic towards men as well, doing it that way as well, because men are not one homogenous bunch. So we shouldn't default to say that that is the only way of being a man, and that's the only way of being a woman. We should celebrate the differences and see actually that there is one successful way.
Thank you. What's your name again?
Tabitha.
Yeah, you know, we've been in touch with activists in women's tennis from like the 1960s and 1970s in the US, and you know, when they started their work, women were getting paid nothing even to attend like international tennis tournaments. You had to like stay on friends' floors, and men were getting like loads of stuff. And people said to them at the time, people are never going to want to watch women play tennis, right? Because they play it in a different way, and the only thing that people want is to watch men play tennis, and that's what the world thinks of as being exciting. And then they pushed and pushed and pushed, and they ended up getting equal prize money for tournaments, and now, of course, you know, Wimbledon has equal prize money and so forth. And what actually happened was that there was a huge demand for watching women play tennis, and in fact, a lot of male tennis players adopted things from the ways that they saw women playing tennis that were different from them. And then, of course, you know, you look at last year's Wimbledon singles finals, right, and the viewership for the men's was like 4.5 million, for the women's was 4.6 million, right? It's all, and I kind of feel secretly like all of this conversation about is the standard high enough is all a trap, right? It's all just another way of saying stay down, stay down, stay down, right? Like, you know, it's the same thing as when John McEnroe says, oh, well, you know, Serena Williams wouldn't be, you know, some male player or other. You just like, just shut up. Right?
I'm just bumping you, James. I'm going to go to Eunice first.
So when Mr. Harding came to our school to do a mini newsroom, I was actually for men being paid more than women, and this was due to, as other people said, demand, and it looked more exciting. But when I got home that day, I started to look at women playing football and other sports more, and I saw that they're actually more passionate than the men, and I think they deserve the exposure, but they're not getting it because because broadcasting companies are afraid to be controversial and change the society that's been created around them, that shows that men should be more more put into the spotlight because they're more exciting, but in actual fact the women are more passionate and more exciting because they actually tried harder to become successful in their field of...
I'm going to make a little note of, I'm going to intervene myself to make a point I would like to make, which is that in thinking about this yesterday, I was thinking about media rights and broadcasting, and I did a little bit of research, and on the slide here you can see all the people in charge of what gets shown on all the major sports channels, and there's one thing in common, except for at the BBC, who are doing a summer of sport, who are doing summer of women's sport, not just women's football, but, you know, netball and other things. And, you know, you have to believe that is extremely significant, and you know, that is the story across the board. You know, the ownership of football clubs, everyone, you know, except for Dean Smith.
Can I say on that as well, and the point you made, that it's so hard to get women in boardrooms, and because they don't push themselves forward. And I've had this argument with women in football, and that's why there's a mentor scheme at women in football, because women are particularly poor, they tell me, at bullshitting the way men do. I can do that. I don't tick all the boxes, but I'm good enough anyway. But a woman might say, "Oh, I don't fit, you know, I don't tick all the boxes there, so I'm not going to go for that job." Jane Purden, the CEO, was the chief legal executive at Sunderland Football Club, and she said she also was the chief legal officer at the Premier League, which is very male, pale, and stale, and it needs changing very badly. Women need to get into admin, they need to get into writing websites, all that, because that's where the power is, boardrooms, and that's how things change. And they're not enough getting into it. When I was chairman of a non-league football club, I promoted 3 women within the club, 2 on the board, made 1 club secretary. It changed the whole environment of the club. Jane Purden wrote to me, the words of Bob Murray, my chairman at Sunderland. He often said to me, "I like having women in the club, I like having them on my board, I like having them in my leadership team, they bring something different to it." And that message needs to get into football more.
Yeah, I just was the flag's gone up, I feel incredibly guilty about this man at the front, and James and Kerry, who can argue out between them who's going to say something. What's your name?
My name's Hugh.
Hi, Hugh.
I was just going to say, I like how you picked the picture of her and really disapproving of the other 6. But really quickly, I think the entire thing can be summed up. This isn't actually about sport. This entire conversation, we haven't talked about like actual, you know, specific sports since the first sort of 10, 15 minutes. Yes, the institutions should all be equalised, but actually this is just a broader symptom of how our society, the world, whatever, views women, treats women, and how we label things. So it was really interesting that it is the Women's World Cup. We refer to it as Women's World Cup. I use Strava. I don't know if other people in here use Strava, but you can get little, like if you run up a hill the quickest, it's separated out by gender. You know, I have spent 26 years of my life being outdone by men and women in sport. I'm just not athletically talented. So the whole labelling, the whole way it goes, you know, you talk about STEM subjects at school, it goes into absolutely all parts of our society. Sport is a symptom, and I think the stuff that Lewes are doing as a sort of a visible symbol of how things can change is great, but we need to go, it's much, much more ingrained in society from a much earlier age than sort of even sort of being 10, 15, 20 years old. It's right back to when you're born.
But don't be overwhelmed by that, because it can change.
Yeah.
That's
What's your name?
Hugh.
Carrie?
Just quickly, to sort of bring it as a positive, I'm Carrie, I work here as well. I think, and to come back to Tallullah's point a bit as well, one of the things that's intriguing, I think, is whether the growth in women's sport and the better focus on it could have a positive effect on men's sport as well. So I watched the quarter-final last night. It's impossible to watch it without thinking, if that foul had been committed on a male player, we would have lost 2 minutes to rolling around and the risk of amputation of some sort. If that challenge had been committed in the penalty area, a male player would have dived. And a lot of the things that people find frustrating and you know, annoying about men's football weren't there last night. And I just wonder whether actually there's a broader effect apart from the sort of the one that we might see in front of us.
Thank you. So I'm going to attempt to sum up this very lively and really quite inspiring conversation, actually. So I think we can all say that we start with the basic premise that there is an ideal and that men and women are paid equally, whatever the job, whether it's sport or not. The argument you hear against that constantly is that there's an economic reality, and there's an economic reality in who watches what the demand is, what the live tickets are, what the sponsorship is. But I think we all agree that everything should push harder towards this utopian idea that, men and women are paid equal. And where I think that it's clear from the conversation that has to start, it starts at the very beginning. And, I was so pleased to have you guys, the school, in the room here, because, I think we really got quite quickly, as someone said, away from sport, right back to the sort of stereotypes that you see in the school corridor, that you obviously feel you're being, pushed out of the frame and what's available to you, and that trickles down even when there are successes, that's not being sold enough to the young team. And we heard the grassroots point from Martin, Eunice, Jasmine, Jessica, I've written all your names down. We talk about equal exposure, and we talk about it on the media channels, but it's quite clear that you're not getting equal exposure in the classroom, and that obviously really bothers me. And there's a huge part of sort of breaking down stereotypes with that, breaking down stereotypes in schools. But I think it was you, Martin, that said, you'd watch bad Chelsea matches, but, when there's women's bad match, people say, it's the women, and when it happens with Chelsea, people say, it's just a bad game. Or it's Chelsea. Look, I will say that there are some, real positives here. I feel that there is a sea change happening. I think even the fact we're having this conversation, the Women's World Cup, you talked about so exposure, but actually, we have got the Summer of Women's World Cup. I am seeing, women on the front of sports pages like never before. And I think the key is trying to keep up that energy around women's sport. And the change, we're talking about the effects being felt at the bottom, but the change has to start at the top. Whatever the sport it is, whether it's Lewes or, the FA, your point about the sort of equitability of the prize money is really important. And that is the case all over. How do we get there as quickly as we can? I think we need more women at the top, whether that's in media rights buying, whether that's on, football boards or any other sort of sports board. It's all about, I think you said, Chris, the people in charge, or somebody, you said the people in charge. And there's so much opportunity there that we're going to see in the future. There are obviously little issues around, pregnancy, protections for women in sport. I think that's key. We didn't really talk about that, but that will come up again. And Laura, you talked about how social media was creating the sea change, which I think is really important. I have to say there's so much that we could talk about, but in terms of sort of a particular story, I actually had no idea that in the 1920s women's football was more popular than men's, but then banned. And I'm not sure anyone in this room knew that, and I just think that this time it's a really
very fragile.
Many men had been killed in Europe, so am I correct in thinking that was the case?
Well, in the 40s.
The women started playing because of the war effort.
Yeah.
But actually, it was because it was 1921. They were still raising money for soldiers' families and stuff. And I think it was the highest ever attendance in a football match ever was a women's game. And the FA just went, ah!
Yeah, so there was... sorry, go ahead. There was I think people thought the women's game would become popular, but it would revert to the men's game being popular when the men came back from the First World War, and it just didn't. And so there were some really vivid attendance comparisons. There was one weekend where there was a match where I think the women played at Everton and they got an attendance of 15,000, and at the same time Manchester United played at home and got an attendance of 13, right, 1-3. And I think it just sort of got too much for the collective men at the FA, and they just said, well, you can't do it anymore. And if you read the verdict at the time, they said that something, it's all horrible, but some of it says something like, we consider this to be an unsuitable pastime for females. So just like that, they're just saying, yeah, you just can't do it, right?
And I think that comes back to Tabitha, Ed, and lots of your points. There's always this sort of default the default to male, and that's what we have to fight against. And I really want to tell that story in Tortoise, and I'd like to thank you all for your contributions, which I think were brilliant, and, you know, especially school, but all of you, it's really great.